On the 25th of October, 1415 AD, the heavy, exhausting drag of armored boots sinking deep into wet clay echoed across a narrow field near Agincourt in northern France. Here, a starving, disease-ridden English army of roughly 6,000 men stood completely trapped before a pristine French host numbering between 20,000 and 30,000 heavily armored men at arms. This confrontation presented a military paradox that defied every established rule of medieval warfare. The French possessed absolute tactical superiority in both numbers and elite equipment, yet thousands of their highest-ranking aristocrats would die that afternoon without ever swinging their swords, suffocating helplessly in the mud of a plowed agricultural field. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the lethal mechanics of the English longbow, the fatal arrogance of divided feudal command, and how the autumn weather and local geography became the ultimate executioners of French chivalry. But to understand how this specific slaughter was engineered, we must first look at the disastrous march that left the English army begging for survival just days before. The campaign began not with a swift, glorious advance, but with a grueling, static siege at the port city of Harfleur in the late summer of 1415 AD. King Henry V had crossed the English Channel to press his dynastic claim to the French throne, expecting a rapid capitulation. Instead, the walls of the city held for 5 agonizing weeks. During that stagnation in the late summer heat, the English camps became a breeding ground for a threat far more lethal than French artillery. Dysentery, known grimly to the soldiers as the bloody flux, tore through the ranks, systematically dismantling the invasion force from the inside out. Thousands of men were incapacitated by severe dehydration and internal bleeding, forcing Henry to send a massive portion of his army back to England simply to keep them alive. Left with a severely diminished force of roughly 1,000 men-at-arms and 5,000 longbowmen, the English king made a high-risk operational decision. Rather than retreating directly across the Channel in defeat, he ordered a 260-mile overland march through hostile territory to the English stronghold of Calais. It was designed as a rapid display of martial defiance, a calculated maneuver meant to humiliate the French crown. But as the campaign stretched into October, the weather violently turned. The English found themselves marching through endless, driving autumn rain. The physical reality of this trek was a daily torture of heavy, rain-soaked woolen garments clinging freezing cold to the skin, while men already hollowed out by disease forced their trembling legs through deep, adhesive mud, burning away their last reserves of bodily strength with every labored step. The grueling timeline of the march was further shattered by French strategic maneuvering. The Royal French Army, mobilizing under the command of Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Jean Lemangre, known as Boucicaut, began to closely shadow the English columns. Recognizing the severe logistical vulnerability of the invaders, the French command methodically destroyed bridges and heavily guarded the vital fords along the river Somme. This blockade forced the English to detour far inland, drastically extending their march, depleting their meager rations, and pushing the discipline and endurance of the men to the absolute breaking point. By the time Henry's vanguard finally found an unguarded crossing and pushed northward, the strategic trap had already closed tight. On the evening of October 24, the English scouts crested a ridge near the village of Agincourt and looked down upon a terrifying sight. The massive, fully assembled French host had successfully bypassed them and completely blocked the only road to Calais. The English had been marching continuously for over 2 weeks, sleeping in the freezing rain and surviving on handfuls of scavenged nuts and spoiled rations. They were cornered, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered. How could a king demand his dying men turn and fight a fresh, pristine army The army that blocked Henry's path to Calais was the absolute apex of European feudal power. Numbering between 20,000 and 30,000 men, the French host was heavily built around dismounted men-at-arms and elite heavy cavalry. Across the rain-soaked expanse, the visual contrast between the two forces was stark. The French lines presented a dense, intimidating wall of polished steel plate, brilliant silk surcoats, and the fluttering heraldic banners of the highest nobility in the realm, while the 6,000 surviving English troops stood ragged, unwashed, and heavily stained with the pale mud of their brutal march. Yet, beneath the formidable exterior of the French vanguard lay a fatal structural vulnerability. The Royal Army was officially commanded by Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, both highly experienced, pragmatic military professionals. However, their chain of command was severely compromised by the presence of dozens of high-ranking lords, royal dukes, and princes of the blood. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe, feudal honor and social status dictated battlefield placement. Every nobleman demanded the prestige of fighting in the front line, eager to claim the personal glory of striking the decisive blow and capturing the English king for a lucrative ransom. This surplus of aristocratic egos meant that d'Albret and Boucicaut could advise their peers, but they could not enforce absolute tactical discipline over a coalition of prideful lords who frequently viewed patience as cowardice. Opposing this massive feudal engine, King Henry V deployed his meager force of 1,000 men-at-arms and 5,000 longbowmen. Facing overwhelming numerical inferiority, the English king anchored his survival entirely on the specific geometry of the battlefield. He positioned his troops across a freshly plowed agricultural field, bounded tightly on either side by the dense woods of Agincourt and Trampled. The critical feature of this terrain was the distance between the two tree lines. It measured a mere 750 yards across. This narrow corridor acted as a geographic straitjacket for the French war machine. To maximize the lethality of an army numbering up to 30,000 men, a commander requires a wide, open plain to extend their lines, deploy cavalry on the flanks, and envelop a smaller enemy force. Pinched between the two impassable forests, the French were entirely stripped of their lateral mobility. Unable to spread outward, the French nobility were forced to stack their vanguard in extreme depth. The men-at-arms organized into massive, tightly packed blocks, rank upon rank, funneling their overwhelming numbers into a confined space where the vast majority of soldiers in the rear echelons would be physically unable to swing a weapon. Henry had deliberately locked his formation into a choke point that completely negated the French numerical advantage, forcing a highly centralized frontal collision where flanking maneuvers were impossible. The French commanders knew the terrain was narrow, but they ignored one vital environmental factor that would turn the field into a mass grave. While the French relied on the sheer crushing weight of their aristocratic vanguard, King Henry V anchored his survival on brutal, calculated pragmatism. He knew that even within the narrow confines of the flanking woods, a concentrated charge by French heavy cavalry could easily shatter the unprotected formations of his longbowmen. To counter this, Henry implemented a strict defensive doctrine. Days earlier on the march, he had ordered every archer to cut a 6-foot wooden stake sharpened to a lethal point at both ends. Now, across the front lines, the heavy, percussive thud of wooden mallets echoed through the cold morning air as thousands of men drove these stakes deep into the wet clay, angling them outward toward the enemy line. This barrier of palings created a bristling makeshift fortress, an anti-cavalry fence explicitly designed to impale charging horses and completely neutralize the kinetic shock of a mounted assault. Standing behind this wooden wall were not the romanticized peasant heroes of later folklore, but 5,000 highly trained, professional military contractors. These English and Welsh archers were calloused, pragmatic specialists whose skeletal structures had been permanently altered by their profession. The weapon they carried, the English yew longbow, was a masterpiece of medieval ballistics that demanded an extraordinary physical toll. With a draw weight frequently ranging between 100 and 150 pounds, pulling the heavy hemp bowstring back to the ear required immense, repetitive exertion of the back and shoulder muscles. It was an engine of brute mechanical force, requiring a lifetime of localized physical conditioning to master. To maximize the lethality of this system, the archers were supplied with large sheaves of bodkin-pointed arrows. These specialized, narrow iron tips were engineered specifically for armored warfare, forged to punch through iron chainmail and violently exploit the vulnerable joints, armpits, and eye slits of French plate armor. The true tactical terror of the longbow, however, lay in its devastating rate of fire. A veteran archer could loose up to 10 arrows in a single minute. With 5,000 men deployed across the English line, Henry possessed the logistical capacity to project a concentrated, plunging barrage of up to 50,000 arrows per minute into a tightly confined 750-yard corridor. It was an industrialized system of localized slaughter, requiring only that the enemy step forward into the designated kill zone. By mid-morning, the English defensive preparations were fully operational. The stakes were firmly planted in the clay, the arrows were struck point first into the mud at the archers' feet for rapid reloading, and the men stood ready behind their palisades. Yet, the French command, perhaps recognizing the lethal geometry of the barrier and the exhaustion of the invaders, simply held their ground. The trap was set, but for 4 agonizing hours, neither side moved. The English were starving, hollowed out by dysentery, and waiting was the one tactical luxury they absolutely could not afford. By late morning, the psychological strain of the standoff reached a critical threshold. Recognizing that his starving men would simply collapse if left exposed to the freezing elements for another night, King Henry V made a desperate, high-stakes tactical gamble. He issued the order to advance. This maneuver violated every doctrine of a static defense. The English archers had to physically uproot their sharpened 6-foot stakes, shoulder them alongside their heavy bows, and march forward across the muddy field. For several agonizing minutes, the entire English line was stripped of its anti-cavalry fortifications. Had the French commanders launched a coordinated cavalry strike at this precise moment of vulnerability, the English army would have been overrun and annihilated before they could even draw their bowstrings. Yet, paralyzed by their own unwieldy command structure and overconfidence, the French nobility failed to exploit the window. The English marched uncontested until they halted roughly 300 yards from the French vanguard, reaching the extreme effective range of the yew longbow. Once the men hurriedly hammered their stakes back into the wet clay, the order was given to unleash the provocation. Without warning, the sudden, deafening mechanical snap of 5,000 thick hemp bowstrings, releasing simultaneously, cut through the silence of the valley. A dense cloud of bodkin-pointed arrows arched high into the gray sky before plunging directly into the packed ranks of the French host. While at this extreme distance the arrows lacked the kinetic energy to easily penetrate heavy steel breastplates, they rained down with enough force to injure unarmored horses, strike vulnerable joints, and incite absolute disorder. This plunging barrage functioned perfectly as a psychological trigger. Within the rigid, pride-driven hierarchy of European chivalry, it was an unbearable insult for the highest-ranking nobles of the realm to stand passively while being battered from afar by low-born peasant archers. The fragile French chain of command instantly fractured. Ignoring the restraining orders of Constable d'Albret, the French mounted cavalry positioned on the flanks broke ranks and initiated an aggressive, entirely uncoordinated charge. Their objective was to rapidly close the 300-yard gap, sweep around the sides of the English formation, and dismantle the exposed Longbowmen. However, the geographic constraints of the 750-yard corridor between the Tramacort and Agincourt woods meant there were no open flanks to exploit. The cavalry was forced to charge headlong into the teeth of the English barrage, funneling directly toward the newly planted wooden palisades. As the heavy war horses thundered across the plowed earth, the English archers maintained a lethal, industrialized rate of fire, unleashing thousands of arrows per minute into the advancing mass. Unarmored horses were driven mad by the pain of arrow strikes, bucking and throwing their heavily armored riders to the ground. Those knights who managed to reach the English lines found their mounts abruptly impaled on the rigid wall of sharpened stakes. The assault collapsed into a static tangle of dying animals and trapped aristocrats. Unable to penetrate the English defenses, the surviving French cavalry panicked and wheeled their horses around to flee back the way they came. The heavy cavalry hit the English flanks, but instead of breaking the archers, their retreat initiated a chain reaction that doomed their own infantry. As the shattered remnants of the French heavy cavalry galloped back in blind panic, they collided directly with the first line of their own advancing dismounted men-at-arms, shattering the vanguard's formation before it had even engaged the enemy. But the true devastation of this disorganized retreat was entirely environmental. The field at Agincourt was not a pristine, hardened meadow. It was freshly plowed agricultural land that had already absorbed weeks of relentless, driving autumn rain. The deep furrows of the plow had trapped the water, softening the earth deep beneath the surface. When the iron-shod hooves of hundreds of terrified, retreating war horses tore through this ground, they acted like a massive mechanical churn. The heavy beasts destroyed the fragile crust of the topsoil, instantly transforming the narrow corridor into a deep, adhesive bog of liquid clay. When the massive French vanguard, consisting of roughly 8,000 dismounted nobles and knights, finally stepped forward to initiate their main assault, they did not march into battle. They waded directly into a geographic snare. The mechanical reality of 15th century European plate armor now became a fatal liability. A fully equipped French man-at-arms wore between 50 and 60 pounds of articulated steel, layered over thick padded doublets and chainmail. On solid, dry ground, this weight was expertly distributed across the body, allowing a trained knight surprising mobility, balance, and endurance. However, in the churned clay of northern France, this armor acted as a deadly anchor. The physical toll of the advance was agonizing. With every single step, the knights had to fight the intense vacuum of the thick, sucking mud, burning immense amounts of muscular energy simply to pry their heavy armored boots free from the earth, only to sink immediately back down to their calves or knees with the next stride. Furthermore, the enclosed steel helmets, or bassinets, severely restricted oxygen intake. Struggling against the deep mud while breathing through narrow visor slits rapidly induced hyperventilation and extreme fatigue. The absolute elite of the French military was being physically drained of its fighting strength before they had even crossed half the distance to the English line. Compounding this severe environmental friction was the inescapable geometry of the battlefield itself. The flanking woods of Tramacort and Agincourt did not run perfectly parallel. They angled slightly inward, creating a natural geographical funnel that narrowed precisely where King Henry V had anchored his defensive line. As the vast French host pressed forward, the thousands of men in the secondary and rear echelons, driven by feudal pride, eager to secure highly lucrative aristocratic ransoms, and completely blind to the logistical disaster unfolding ahead of them, continued to push aggressively forward. The commanders at the rear could not see the mud trapping the vanguard, and thus they issued no orders to halt. This relentless rearward pressure forced the advancing knights to converge inward as the field narrowed, continuously shrinking the lateral space available to each individual soldier. This severe compression stripped the French elite of their primary martial advantage, which was the ability to actually wield their polearms. To effectively swing a heavy poleaxe, a halberd, or a hand-and-a-half sword with lethal kinetic force, a dismounted knight requires a clear radius of physical space. As the geographical funnel forced the French lines tighter and tighter together, the men-at-arms found themselves packed shoulder to shoulder, their armored bodies grinding against one another in the freezing mud. The strict unit cohesion required for a disciplined infantry advance rapidly dissolved into a claustrophobic, disorganized crush. Knights who tripped over the hidden furrows or slipped in the churned clay were immediately trampled by the men directly behind them, pinned to the earth by the sheer weight of the advancing crowd. The very size of the Royal French Army had been brilliantly weaponized against them, turning their overwhelming numerical superiority into a mechanism for their own mass immobilization. Bereft of lateral mobility, drained of their physical stamina by the adhesive clay, and physically pinned by the crushing kinetic weight of their own advancing comrades, the French vanguard lost nearly all forward momentum. They were no longer an unstoppable feudal juggernaut. They were a static, densely packed target locked within a 750-yard trench. They were moving at a suffocating crawl, completely exposed, directly into the optimal killing zone of the English longbow. As the paralyzed French vanguard trudged into this 300-yard corridor, the English longbowmen unleashed the full terrifying capacity of their industrialized barrage. A persistent historical misconception dictates that these bodkin-pointed arrows effortlessly punched straight through the thickest hardened steel breastplates of the French nobility. The tactical reality was far more complex and agonizing. While a direct, perpendicular hit at close range might compromise lesser armor, the plunging, parabolic fire of the English longbows primarily exploited the structural gaps in the knight's harness. Tens of thousands of arrows hammered down, systematically finding the lighter chainmail protecting the armpits, the articulated joints of the elbows and knees, and the exposed backs of the legs. To survive this relentless aerial bombardment, the French men-at-arms were forced to make a fatal mechanical adjustment. To protect the highly vulnerable, exposed eye slits of their bassinet helmets from the descending iron points, the knights had to bow their heads and advance looking directly down at the churned earth. By lowering their visors and their gaze, the entire French front line was rendered effectively blind. They could no longer see the English defensive formations, the sharpened wooden stakes waiting in the clay, or the fallen bodies of their own comrades directly in their path. The metallic, percussive clatter of thousands of arrows striking steel plate echoed across the field like a deafening iron hail, an overwhelming sensory barrage that entirely masked the shouted orders of the few commanders desperately trying to maintain unit cohesion. Blind, completely drained of physical stamina, and bleeding from secondary joint wounds, the survivors of the French vanguard finally collided with the thin, ragged line of English men-at-arms anchored in the center of the field. King Henry's heavily outnumbered infantry, fighting with the desperate ferocity of men who knew retreat meant death, locked their shields and braced their heavy poleaxes, forming a rigid, unyielding wall. The French forward momentum abruptly halted. However, the thousands of armored men in the secondary echelons of the French host did not stop. Completely ignorant of the tactical gridlock occurring at the front and driven by a fierce feudal hunger to cross blades with the English king, the rear ranks continued to violently press forward into the ever-narrowing corridor. This relentless forward pressure triggered a catastrophic mass compression. The fundamental physics of the battlefield shifted abruptly from a military engagement to a lethal, self-inflicted crowd collapse. As the rear echelons forcefully rammed into the stalled vanguard, the men at the front were violently pinned against the English shields. The density of armored bodies became so extreme that French knights found their arms locked firmly to their sides. In this claustrophobic vice of steel and flesh, it became physically impossible for the absolute elite of the European military to even raise a sword, draw a dagger, or swing a poleaxe. The churned agricultural clay beneath them transitioned into an inescapable snare. As exhausted men slipped in the mud or collapsed from sheer physical depletion, the unyielding wave of bodies marching blindly from behind simply trampled directly over them. Knights, encased in 60 pounds of plate armor, who lost their footing, were immediately driven deep into the liquid earth by the immense kinetic weight of their advancing comrades. Unable to rise, hundreds of high-ranking aristocrats suffocated in the wet mud without ever striking a single blow, victims of mass asphyxiation engineered entirely by their own uncoordinated bulk. The French army had successfully trapped itself within a prison built of its own overwhelming numbers. With the French immobilized by their own numbers and the mud, the English archers made a decision that violated every rule of medieval warfare. Seeing the French vanguard locked in a static, suffocating crush, the English and Welsh archers recognized that the engagement had fundamentally shifted. With their quivers empty and the enemy line hopelessly paralyzed, the 5,000 bowmen ceased their barrage. They dropped their heavy yew-bows and drew their secondary weapons, short swords, hatchets, daggers, and the same heavy lead mauls and wooden mallets they had used to drive their defensive stakes. Abandoning the safety of their palisades, these lightly clad infantrymen surged forward directly into the churned clay. Without the burden of 60 pounds of steel plate, they moved with a terrifying agility over the very mud that had completely immobilized their aristocratic enemies. The ensuing melee effectively dismantled the traditional rules of European chivalry. In standard feudal combat, men of noble birth fought their equals, yielding to capture when defeated in exchange for a highly lucrative ransom. The archers, acting as professional military contractors, did not adhere to this aristocratic code. Moving swiftly through the paralyzed French ranks, they exploited the enemy's exhaustion with grim, pragmatic efficiency. The battlefield echoed with the hollow, percussive thud of wooden mallets and lead mauls repeatedly striking steel helmets as commoners bludgeoned exhausted lords into the mud. Knights who could barely lift their arms were systematically pulled down, their armor's weak points pierced by daggers. It was a stark subversion of the medieval social order, executed with cold industrial precision. As the English men-at-arms simultaneously pushed forward to exploit the gridlock, thousands of surviving French nobles eventually yielded, realizing that resistance in the compression was physically impossible. The English forces rapidly amassed a staggering number of high-status captives, disarming them and organizing them at the rear of their lines. However, this massive influx of prisoners created an immediate, severe security risk. The exhausted English troops were now vastly outnumbered by the very men they had just taken hostage. The tactical situation then suddenly deteriorated. At the rear of the English lines, a local French noble, Jesembart de Agincourt, led a localized cavalry raid against the lightly guarded English baggage train, plundering royal supplies and stealing King Henry V's spare crown. Simultaneously, elements of the massive French Third Battle, the rear echelon which had not yet engaged in the fighting, began to reorganize on the far side of the field, appearing to form up for a renewed assault. Henry V looked at his depleted, starving army and then at the thousands of captured French men-at-arms standing idle in his camp. If the French rearguard charged, the English would be forced to turn and fight, leaving the prisoners completely unattended. Henry recognized the lethal probability that the captives, seeing a second wave approaching, might simply pick up the discarded weapons littering the ground and overwhelm his army from the inside out. Faced with this existential threat, the English king made a ruthless, highly controversial command decision. He ordered the immediate execution of the French prisoners. The command was initially met with deep reluctance from the English men-at-arms. For a knight, killing an unarmed captive was a severe violation of chivalric honor, and pragmatically, it meant the permanent forfeiture of immense ransom wealth. Unwilling to let tactical security be compromised by noble pride, Henry bypassed his aristocrats and ordered a contingent of 200 archers to carry out the task. The systematic execution of the captives began as a cold military calculus driven entirely by the absolute necessity of survival rather than mere cruelty. Observing this ruthless demonstration of resolve, and witnessing the sheer scale of the demographic devastation already inflicted upon their vanguard, the remaining French forces lost all appetite for a renewed engagement. The rallying rearguard fractured and began a slow, despondent withdrawal from the field, leaving the English in total control of the muddy corridor. The battlefield was secured, but the cost in noble blood would shatter the political foundation of an entire nation. The immediate aftermath of the slaughter at Agincourt revealed a profound demographic shock for the French state. While English losses were comparatively light, estimated at roughly 600 men, the French nobility suffered an irreparable blow. The casualty lists confirmed the deaths of 3 dukes, 5 counts, and approximately 90 barons, effectively decapitating the political and military leadership of the realm. This concentrated loss of life was not merely a temporary military failure. It was a severe societal trauma that left the French administration vulnerable to further internal fracture and sustained external pressure. The collapse of the French military effort accelerated the geopolitical disintegration of the kingdom. With his martial capacity shattered and his leadership elite destroyed in the mud, King Charles VI of France was eventually compelled to sign the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 AD. This agreement formally recognized King Henry V of England as the legal heir to the French throne, a dramatic realignment that threatened the very survival of the Valois dynasty. It represented the zenith of the English campaign, achieved through the disciplined use of ranged infantry against the traditional feudal host. The engagement served as a definitive turning point in European military history. Agincourt demonstrated that the era of heavy cavalry supremacy was waning, yielding to the tactical efficiency of disciplined, ranged infantry. The battle proved that the Longbow, combined with rigorous training and the intelligent exploitation of terrain, could dismantle the traditional feudal order. The heavy plate armor that had defined the medieval knight proved insufficient when confronted with a high-volume, professional infantry force capable of dictating the terms of engagement. The distinct metallic ring of arrows striking plate armor across the field had signaled the end of a defensive paradigm. The legacy of Agincourt remains a study in the limitations of aristocratic pride when challenged by organized, pragmatically deployed force. King Henry V had achieved an improbable success, altering the balance of power across the English Channel for a generation. The fields near Agincourt stand as a monument to the end of the traditional chivalric era, marking the emergence of modern military doctrines that favored structural discipline over individual renown. Please subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.